The tension in the Ontario legislature was palpable as Premier Doug Ford stepped up to the microphone at Queen's Park. His usual political swagger replaced by a grim determination that reflected the gravity of the moment. Ford's public declaration of distrust toward President Trump marked a dramatic departure from the diplomatic niceties that typically characterize Canada and USA relations, signaling that even traditionally business-friendly conservative politicians were preparing for economic warfare. His blunt warning to reporters carried an unmistakable urgency. Fasten your seatbelts, CUSMA or USMCA. Whatever you want to call it, he is coming at us hard. He is going to come at us with everything he has, and we have to make sure that we're ready. The Premier's stark assessment reflected weeks of behind-the-scenes intelligence gathering and economic modeling that painted an increasingly dire picture of Canada's trade vulnerability. Ford's advisors had been working overtime since Trump's return to office, analyzing potential scenarios where the USA could weaponize trade agreements against Canadian interests, particularly targeting Ontario's manufacturing heartland. The province's auto sector, steel industry, and energy exports all remained exposed to potential American retaliation, creating a web of economic dependencies that kept Ford's team awake at night as they gamed out various defensive strategies. What made Ford's warnings particularly ominous was his prediction about the timeline of potential trade disruption. Rather than waiting for the scheduled 2026 USMCA review, Ford warned that Trump could act unilaterally and immediately. He's not waiting until 2026. At any given time, President Trump, not that he even follows the rules, he can pull the carpet out from underneath us on CUSMA tomorrow with one signature. This assessment reflected a fundamental shift in how Canadian politicians viewed their southern neighbor, moving from predictable trade partner to unpredictable economic adversary capable of sudden, devastating moves. Prime Minister Mark Carney's response to Ford's public warnings demonstrated the delicate balance Ottawa was trying to maintain between preparation and provocation. Carney had already been coordinating with provincial premiers in his cabinet to develop comprehensive tariff response strategies. But Ford's public statements forced the federal government to acknowledge the seriousness of the threat more openly than officials preferred. The Prime Minister's call for preparedness came during closed-door meetings, where federal and provincial officials shared intelligence about potential USA trade actions and coordinated response mechanisms that could be activated within hours of any American move. The automotive sector became the focal point of Ford's concerns, given Ontario's role as the hub of Canadian car manufacturing and the integrated nature of North American auto production. Companies like Ford Motor Company of Canada, General Motors Canada, and Stellantis had invested billions in Ontario facilities based on USMCA trade certainties. But Ford's warnings suggested these investments could be at risk if Trump decided to renegotiate terms. The Premier pointed to the recent closure of smaller auto parts suppliers as early warning signs of what could happen if trade relationships deteriorated further, with communities like Windsor, Oshawa, and Cambridge potentially facing devastating economic impacts. Ford's public distrust of Trump represented more than just political posturing. It reflected genuine economic intelligence that suggested the USA President was actively exploring ways to pressure Canada through trade mechanisms. Ontario government sources, speaking privately, indicated that Ford had received briefings about Trump administration officials discussing scenarios where USMCA could be reopened under national security provisions or other legal mechanisms that would bypass the normal review timeline. These discussions had convinced Ford that public warnings were necessary to prepare both businesses and voters for potential economic disruption that could arrive with little advance notice. The energy sector emerged as another critical vulnerability in Ford's analysis, particularly given Ontario's role in supplying electricity to neighboring USA states and the province's significant natural gas processing infrastructure. Ford's team had war-gamed scenarios where Trump could target Canadian energy exports as leverage in broader trade negotiations, potentially disrupting power grids on both sides of the border, while inflicting maximum economic pain on Ontario communities. The Premier's advisors pointed to Trump's willingness to use energy as a geopolitical weapon in other contexts, as evidence that Canadian energy infrastructure could become a target in any escalated trade conflict. The coordination between Ford and Carney, despite their different political affiliations, demonstrated the bipartisan nature of the perceived threat from Trump's trade policies. Federal and provincial officials had been meeting regularly to align their messaging and ensure that any Canadian response to USA trade aggression would be swift and coordinated across all levels of government. Ford's public statements served as both a warning to Trump that Canada was prepared to fight back, and a signal to Canadian businesses that they should begin developing contingency plans for various trade war scenarios that government officials were taking seriously. Behind Ford's public warnings lay a sophisticated economic analysis that revealed just how vulnerable Ontario's economy had become to USA trade decisions. The province's manufacturing sector employed hundreds of thousands of workers whose jobs depended on smooth cross-border trade relationships. While Ontario's agricultural exports, technology companies, and natural resource industries all maintained significant exposure to USA market access, Ford's economic team had calculated that even minor disruptions to USMCA could cost Ontario tens of thousands of jobs and billions in economic output, making early preparation essential for minimizing potential damage. The broader implications of Ford's warnings extended far beyond Ontario's borders, serving as a wake-up call for Canadian businesses and investors who had grown comfortable with the apparent stability of North American trade relationships. Stock markets reacted nervously to Ford's comments, while business organizations began accelerating their own contingency planning processes and lobbying efforts designed to maintain trade access regardless of political tensions. Ford's message was clear. The era of taking Canada and USA trade for granted was over, and both governments and businesses needed to prepare for a more volatile and unpredictable economic relationship with their largest trading partner. Doug Ford's blunt warning about Trump and USMCA represents a turning point in how Canadian leaders are approaching our relationship with the United States. When a business-friendly, conservative premier publicly declares distrust of an American president and warns about trade deal sabotage, you know the situation has reached a critical level. From auto plants in Windsor to energy facilities across Ontario, Ford's message signals that Canadian leaders are finally acknowledging what many have suspected. The era of predictable North American trade is over. If you want to stay informed about these rapidly evolving trade tensions and how they'll impact jobs, investments, and prices across Canada, make sure you subscribe to Wes's Best and hit that notification bell for breaking coverage. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand why Ford's warnings matter for every Canadian business and worker, because these trade battles will shape our economic future for years to come.